I'd like to go right to that because we do not have a quorum. We were not going to talk about minutes. I don't have any other administrative announcements, but if the other members do, we could definitely hold that if we could until after discussion of item 5 in respect to the guests that we have. So is there any objection to going to item 5? Okay, so then let's begin with that. So we have, for those that aren't aware, Chapter 41 of the San Francisco Administrative Code was adopted back in 1981 to preserve residential guest rooms that were defined by an initial unit usage report process. And that involved all apartment buildings and hotels that had guest rooms at the time. Prior to that, there was a moratorium. And then the board adopted the ordinance. There has been no updates in the reporting or the permit to convert or other aspects of this since 1990, and that particular amendment had to do with the in lieu fee formula. So Supervisor Peskin's office asked the Department of Building Inspection, which is in charge of educating and enforcing Chapter 41, what were some of the deficiencies. We did give them that information. They then worked with the stakeholders that they determined were pertinent to their legislation and came up with this particular ordinance. I will tell you that the discussions that I had with the supervisor's office, at least the majority of those were with the city attorney in attendance, so they were attorney-client privileged. There was some discussion as to why this did not get discussed at this body before. That's a very good reason. This is a task force of the Board of Supervisors, and the sponsoring legislator chose not to put it on the agenda. That being said, had we had a quorum last month or before, I would have been more than happy to announce that it was out there. Although there was really nothing to discuss until the supervisor introduced the legislation, which was the first week in December, and it did not go to a public hearing until January 23rd, so it sat out there for a number of weeks. I am also aware that our legislative manager for the Department of Building Inspection did mention it to our commission as part of his legislative report that was part of our director's report. There was some question also I did hear as to why it didn't go to the Building Inspection Commission. And the reason is because it sits in the administrative code. It is not required for the building inspection to have a hearing on it before it gets adopted by or reviewed by the Board of Supervisors. So the city attorney advised the BIC, the Building Inspection Commission, that there is not a requirement for it to hear any changes to the administrative code, despite the fact that the items could be directly under the Department of Building Inspection for implementation. And this is not new. When the Chapter 41A that dealt with short-term rentals had changes and it was still under DBI, it was the same situation. However, that being said, there was a hearing about this after it got approved by the board yesterday at the commission. So if anybody wants to avail themselves of that, that's on video. You can take a look at that. It's basically a report of what the board already did. So this legislation, file number 161291, was sponsored by Supervisor Peskin initially. By the time it got adopted by the board unanimously, there were 8 sponsors, 8 individual supervisors sponsoring the legislation, and none of them, from my understanding, offered any amendments except for Supervisor Peskin having to do with floor plans. So that's kind of the background of the legislation. Now we could probably get into what it does and what does that mean for the residential property owners. So let me just say that if a residential hotel owner or operator is keeping the appropriate records that are required by the ordinance, if they're filing the annual unit usage report, and this would be for the for-profit hotels, if they are renting in the high season as what is provided, if they are not doing illegal tourist rentals, then everything that's within the legislation shouldn't be a problem for them. But there are changes, and we'll go to what those changes are, because when you have an ordinance that's over 30 years old, you are going to have to update it with respect to a lot of those items: code enforcement tools, reporting tools, permit to convert. So, how did this get to Supervisor Peskin's attention? And I can only give you some of the information that I'm aware of. I don't know the full picture, but this basically came to his attention based on constituency concerns involving some permits to convert that involved a series of approximately 4 hotels. He made statements about his concerns regarding this and the planning code relationship to this some months ago. And I think there were concerns that constituents brought to his attention regarding the fact that a lot of residential rooms were being de facto converted to weekly tourist rentals, because at the time the ordinance was contemplated and adopted back in 1981, there wasn't really anything called the internet or the ability to advertise the rental of rooms on the internet. Now, the breakdown of the residential hotel rooms are such that Supervisor Peskin and Supervisor Kim have the most within their districts. He has approximately 218. Supervisor Kim has approximately 175, and then there's a distribution from there. The next highest would be Supervisor Ronan at about 42, and that's both nonprofit and for-profit, at least based on what's been reported to us. So the ordinance does 5 essential things, and then we could get into that. The first is it clarifies and adds some pertinent definitions. It updates the record-keeping provisions. It revises the annual reporting requirements, and it refines the criteria necessary to file a permit to convert some or all of the residential guest rooms that are certified by the ordinance and the certificate of use. Each building would have that if they're a residential hotel, and it modernizes antiquated code enforcement tools. So, what were the deficiencies related to that? So, with respect to the record keeping, the daily log, weekly report, and rent receipts were a construction that were created in 1981, and that was the city's best guess on how to track the actual rental of the residential rooms. It was always the intent of the city that these rooms be a permanent residential rental, and that's why the original designation used the time frame of 32 days. If the room was occupied for 32 days contiguously from, I think it was September 23rd, 1979, the room was characterized as residential. If the rental was less, it was characterized as tourist. There was an initial period of time where the property owner or the operator of the hotel provided information to the city, and the city made a designation. If the property owner or the operator didn't agree with that decision, then they had the ability to, within, I think it was like a 90-day period, to contest that. This predates me by a number of years. I've not been associated with it that long, but all this had happened a number of years before I became involved in the, I actually became involved more so in the 90s. So that was the background of this. So these are the areas where there are changes. So with respect to the record keeping, one of the things that you'll see is the ordinance requires, when you file your annual unit uses report, right now you're supposed to keep the daily logs and give us 3 or 4 days, a snapshot of 4 days within that calendar year. This ordinance changes it so it will now be 12, and it will be triggered around a Friday or so, because we know that from experience that if there's going to be some changes, it's going to be around the weekend. And so we want to see if that building has all residential units and it's not in the high season, what is going on, because we're seeing a lot of conversion. So that is one of the reasons why that particular change was made. These are records that you would be keeping. It's just that you'll be attaching those to the annual unit uses reports so that we get a better snapshot of what's happening throughout the year. That's one thing. The other is the definition of tourist rental is now been more clearly defined under this ordinance. You'll see that in the definitions section. And it no longer indicates, and I know this is probably the biggest concern for everybody, that the 7-day situation that was for unlawful rental. Why did it say 7 days? Well, one of the things that we see is, from looking at the history, that provision was put in because at the time the city thought that the target group renting these rooms couldn't necessarily pay, not always pay in increments of more than 7 days. Now it will be the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. We don't necessarily put restrictions on you there so long as it's a residential rental. Okay, so that means that for those, even under the ordinance without these changes, because these changes are not yet implemented. Let's go back to that for a second. There was a public hearing at the Land Use Committee on January 23rd, and then the following, that was a Monday, the following Tuesday this went to the full board, its first reading, it was adopted unanimously, and then it went to its second reading the following, so it was the 31st, and I think then the 7th of February. So it had its second reading, it was approved unanimously. Now what happens? Well, it goes over to the mayor. The mayor has 10 days in which to act on it. If he doesn't do anything within 10 days, it would go into effect 30 days thereafter, or if he signs it, it goes into effect 30 days thereafter. That's how it becomes effective. So that's where we are right now. It's over to the mayor. And if he was to veto it, and I'm not saying he is or not, I'm saying if he is, then it would go back to the board, and then they need so many votes to override it. But since it was adopted unanimously, I don't think that necessarily would occur. So that's the process of adoption. It is not the law of the land just yet, but let's get back to the issue of illegal use of residential rooms. If you have, say, 50 residential guest rooms and no tourist rooms in the building, and we're not between May and September where you can rent 25% of those rooms for tourist use, provided you attempt to rent them for residential use first. So if we're not dealing with the temporary change in occupancy, then and you were renting those rooms on a 7-day basis on the internet to tourists, you're violating the ordinance according to the city. Now, you may not think so, but that's always been the city's position. So in our reading of the totality of the ordinance, so that is a concern. In any case, so that's without any changes here. So I just want to make that clear. That's been the city's position for a number of years, because these are supposed to be residential rentals. Anyway, so getting back to this, that was the record keeping. So one of the things that the city was seeing is the daily logs, the weekly reports, and the rent receipts don't necessarily reflect how the building is actually being rented. Right? These were a construction of the ordinance, but not your typical business records. Hence, the city attorney recommended, this was not a DBI recommendation, that in the future, one of the things that's in here is the city will be able to ask through administrative subpoena to look at your business records if we feel that the building is being operated other than the way that is prescribed by the ordinance. That is new. That will be something of first impression to DBI. We'll be working with the city attorney on how to implement that, because the inspectors have not had experience with that. The city attorney recently did issue administrative subpoena to a hotel, so they do have some experience with that. So we'll be working with them on that. That is new. The period of tenancy, as I said, it would now be 32 days, which is consistent with the provision that's already in the ordinance regarding the original designation of the rooms. And that is consistent with that. And then the annual reporting, on the annual unit uses report, some of the changes you're going to see there is, if you don't file or you don't file completely, there is much more significant consequences rather than a one-time amount. Now, even though it talks about, the ordinance talks about it could be on a daily, the penalty could be on a daily situation, no one ever gets the full amount of that. Our staff is always working with people to get them to file, and we're always hearing from property owners, well, I have a new lessee, so the 2 years worth of records that I was supposed to keep, the lessee was supposed to have it, they're gone, what do I do? Well, obviously, there'll be greater consequences for not keeping those records. And if the property owner, just because you lease the property to somebody, as far as the city is concerned, our legal relationship is with you, the property owner. So you are still responsible to make sure that the lessee does what it's supposed to. We have no control over your lessee. So from that standpoint, one of the things that we will be planning on doing is having a more detailed workshop with owners and operators if they'd like to come in and go through some of this record keeping. The other thing that will happen is, since a new notice annual unit usage report won't be due until November of this year, we will be sending out notification a lot earlier to give you, as the owner and the operators, much more guidance and information regarding how to fill these things out as you get closer. So you've got the tools necessary to succeed on this. And any of you that are leasing hotels, you want to look at those provisions and make sure that there's language in there that make sure that your operator is aware that they've got to comply with this when it goes into effect. And offline we could get more detail about discussions of that as we move forward. But in any case, that's definitely something to look at. And I don't know, is anybody here really interested in me going into a lot of detail about the application for the permit to convert? I'll touch upon it. One of the things that it does is it requires a lot more information up front when you're wanting to file a permit to convert some of the residential guest rooms and get them out of the residential designation. And there's several options that the ordinance gives you. One is in lieu fees. That formula did not change. But if you are wanting to locate the new rooms in a different building, then the city wants a little more information for how you're making that contribution. So that is in there. And if anybody, after you read that, if you have any questions about that, please follow up with me and I can give you a lot more information. But that's where those changes were. The other thing that the city was concerned with was, say you've got 3 or 4 hotels that want to bunch up and then they want to take a number of their rooms and they want to have them replaced in a separate building. What are the contributions that they're making to be able to do that? And if they had a number of their residential rooms vacant for a period of time and they're now telling the city what the current market rate would be for those rooms, we want a little more information as to when they were last occupied, what that was. And why is that? Well, that's because when this ordinance was created, and keep in mind I didn't write this ordinance, I wasn't part of this original adoption, is that these rooms are targeted for low-income, elderly, and disabled. So there's this whole notion of comparability, and so the changes in this legislation are meant, as far as the permit to convert portion, to give us a lot more information to be able to determine what the comparability is. The language in the ordinance for the last 30 some odd years really needed to be updated, and so that's the changes that you see there. And again, if anybody, as you look through this, if you have any further questions, I will leave my business card so people can follow up with me on that. So that is the permit to convert. Now let's move to the violations, because there's some significant changes there. Obviously the penalties are a little more substantial for illegal conversion and for not keeping your records or filing the annual report. And one of the things that it does do, and we can go over some pages here, I'll take questions in a moment, but one of the things it does do is it basically says that if you're not keeping the records or you're not filing the annual unit usage report, the city is going to be able to say, that temporary change in occupancy where you get to take 25% of your residential rooms and rent them for tourist use from the beginning of May to the end of September, we're going to take it away from you for that year. So that is new, that is significant. We hope we never have to do that. We hope that because keeping the records and filing the annual unit uses report once you get a template that works for you, it's not a difficult thing to do. Now there's a new part of that, and that is the floor plan. That means that in addition to filing your report once a year, you're going to need to give us a floor plan in addition to that third page or the second page of the annual unit usage report where you tell us what rooms are residential, what rooms are tourist, what floors are on. We want a floor plan. Now, you may not have a floor plan right now, so you're going to have one drafted. We're not going to need to have something, that's really ornate, but it should be to scale, and if it's a reduction that shows all the floors in the rooms and then you indicate what's residential, what's tourist, what the floor is, and what's vacant, then that stays that way for that entire year unless you change it. There's already a provision in the ordinance that says that if you change the designation of the rooms, you need to tell us by the next business day if it is from a change that since you filed your annual unit usage report. So what does that mean? Say you have a residential hotel that has 25 residential guest rooms and 25 tourist guest rooms. These are certified under the certificate of use. So on, for the November, 1st filing of the annual unit usage report for that particular calendar year, you say that, the first 25 rooms, 1 through 25 are residential, 26 through 50 are tourist, right? And you can't move those designations around within the building. So room 1 that was residential, you can make that tourist, provided that you don't violate, and this would be up to you. I don't enforce this. You don't violate any landlord-tenant law under the state. You don't violate the rent ordinance, and so it's validly vacant, right? So you can do that. If the room becomes vacant, now you want to make that residential or tourist, you can. You just have to let us know by the next business day by giving us a list in writing. That's the law right now. This is just saying that you'd add that floor plan on. And actually, the landlords out there, this is useful for you to have the lessee give this to you so that you can follow what's going on within the building to make sure that rooms aren't morphing into something else. A lot of these buildings have dwelling units as well. So there may be 1 or 2 dwelling units that was for a manager or whatever, and those are morphing into rooms. And that, that's not really a DBI issue, except that we're looking at what your legal use is supposed to be as far as how many guest rooms and how many dwelling units. Where you run into problem with that is with planning and the reduction of dwelling units, right? But a lot of these dwelling units all had sleeping rooms that take access off of the hallway. So there's nothing to preclude an operator for using some rooms for themselves or for the management. It's just that if you start to change the configuration around, you start to trigger other possible violations, say of the building code, etc. So for you to keep track of what's going on in your building, that floor plan is actually a useful thing for you to have for your records as well, so you can see our rooms now, is there an office going on, or is there too many rooms being used for storage? And if you see a lot of rooms being used for storage, are they being maintained? The city's position is, if you take the unit offline, and there's no rule to make you rent the unit, you can have it vacant. We can't force you, but you have to maintain it. So 20, 30 years ago, if you took a room offline and it had, it was in dilapidated condition, and you said to the city, I'm not renting it, so therefore I shouldn't have to deal with it. That's no longer the case. We want you to keep it maintained. But if you don't want to rent it, that's one thing. But if you start to use it for storage or something else, you can't really officially call it storage. And if we go in and we see rooms that are supposed to be used for residential and they're being used for something else, we're going to question that. The other change in the definition is the notion of conversion. Not every change of a residential room is a conversion that triggers the replacement units. If you have an entirely residential, if your building is all residential guest rooms, and you want to create, good morning, we've got copies of the ordinance here for you if you need it. If you wanted to change a room for a lounge or something that's going to be for the use of your permanent residence, you can do that. What the change here says, though, is if you have a combination of residential and tourist rooms, and you want to create something for that you're saying is for the residential units, you need to show us how that's going to be achieved, or we're going to ask you to use part of your tourist inventory first, okay? Because we can't, if you say it's going to be for the residential tenants, but it's really going to be a breakfast room for the tourist component of your inventory, the problem is the code tells me that it can't be used that way. So there were some refinements there as well. So I just want to point that out. Take a look at it. And again, if you have any questions about that, let me know. So that's kind of a summary of this. So what I'd like to do from that is open this up to the membership for discussion and any questions they might have. I would be more than happy to answer these as I can. As I say, on the administrative subpoena, that's going to be a case of first impression for DBI, so we're going to have to come up with a set of procedures for that. And, you know, we'd be more than happy as we get that defined. We'll be sharing that with the rest of you once this ordinance get adopted. I mean, I envision that it will be. If it doesn't, then it has no force and effect. So with that, I want to open this up for the membership for discussion and any questions. And then we'll get to the audience and we'll be more than happy to talk with you. Any questions or comments about it? And we may have to do this in the future too. I mean, there'll be having to deal with this and administrate it. It's, you know, it's going to be, I'm envisioning that I'm going to have to add some additional staff to be able to deal with this, so.
Did DBI meet with any stakeholders while this was all going through the
we met with
process?
the supervisor. It was the supervisor's legislation. He's an experienced legislator. That's up to him. We answered the questions that the supervisor had, and then there were the public hearings. It wasn't our ordinance, it was the supervisor's.
So the answer is no.
What?
So the answer is no.
The answer is that it wasn't our duty to do that. It was to respond. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that Peskin has 218 properties in his district.
Yes.
Do you know how many operators, owners he met with his stakeholders?
I do not know. You'd have to ask his office.
What about Jane Kim? She has 175.
I do not know. You'd have to ask her.
All right, terrific. And I just took a quick peek at our agendas for January. I couldn't find December. We had one November.
There wasn't a quorum.
All the way back to August. Wasn't, well, yeah, but there was no mention in the agenda that it was going to be an item to talk about this.
Because I had no information. It was not yet, introduced, and I will tell you that there would have been speculation at that point because I don't know if it was ever going to get introduced.
But there was no heads up at all to any of the stakeholders?
Because I didn't have any information as to what they were going to do. The supervisor did do that several months ago when he expressed the concern with respect to the permit to convert. But what he was going to do was totally up to him.
Got it. Thank you, Rosemary.
You're welcome. Any other questions or discussions from the members of the task force?
Just quickly, Rosemary, could you repeat the number of SROs in each?
Sure, and we have that citywide. So, and I'm using the word approximately. We're pretty we feel that these are pretty accurate, but you know, buildings can sometimes change designations. So, in District 3, we're looking at 218. That is Supervisor Peskin's district. That is the highest. The next is Supervisor Kim at 175. And then the next would be Supervisor Roden, District 9 at 42. And then it drops off significantly to, let's see, Supervisor Breed at 17. And that's District 5, and then Supervisor Farrell at 16, District 2, and then Supervisor Sheehy, which is District 8 at 12, and then everything else appears to be less than 10, so they are scattered throughout the city.
Thank you.
We're looking at an inventory of approximately 18,840 residential guest rooms throughout, and that is within the for-profit and the non-profit hotels, at least with the reporting information we have. That could always change. And the total number, how that breaks out is we have, well, I think that gives you a good overall.
That is most useful. Thank you.
Okay. Any other discussion or questions from the membership? Okay. Now, technically, we would go to public comment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We still don't have a quorum, so this is not a quorum meeting. So, and generally, we would just open it up to public comment. But I think from an informational standpoint, I'm also going to try and answer your questions. And the only reason I say this is under the Sunshine Ordinance. We allow for public comment, so you get to say whatever, but if you have questions, I'll try and answer them. And if there are things that we need to talk about offline that is more specific, I'm more than happy to do that. So with that, is there any public comment on this particular item? Sir?
I had a question on page 3, on line 12. It says something about the being able to rent out, as we do in the summer, 25% in the winter months.
Okay, so let's go to that so that and I apologize, I am hard of hearing. I have my hearing aids in.
Sorry,
But what was the
it was the
line item?
Talking about renting out residential units on a short-term basis during winter months is my question. About more technical, what is that one? I was confused.
Okay.
Because I thought it was just May 1st through September 30th.
It's page 3, line.
Starting line, the paragraph 12, starting line 12.
Right, and this is, what you're looking at there is not a change to the ordinance.
Really?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. The document that you've got in front of you, anything that is an addition is underlined and it's done in italics. If the proposal is to remove it, it's got a strikeout. So everything that is left is part of the original language of the ordinance. It wasn't changed by this particular ordinance. So in looking at this, what this is basically talking about is renting residential use on a short-term basis during the winter months.
I just never noticed that before.
Right, yeah, this has to do with the reasoning going back to the inception of the ordinance, because this hasn't been changed. The only thing that they did do was to change the letter next to it. So what we're essentially looking at here is this was kind of the findings, right? This isn't the actual. It's not part of the ordinance that really has a regulatory part of it. It had to do with probably what ultimately became the provision later on that deals with the term temporary change in occupancy, and why that was from May to September rather than in the winter. So that was to encourage probably the target audience to have some rentals within the winter. But this ordinance doesn't change that.
No, but is that still valid? Because if that's still valid and I'm able to convert some rooms, I didn't know the technicality of it, because in the summer I have a specific formula that I can do this percentage if I've turned in all the paperwork, but there was nothing to mention about winter.
Right, because this is part of the findings, the overall findings that created the regulatory part of the ordinance that then begins subsequent to that, right? So let me pull the whole ordinance out here.
So how many rooms could somebody rent during the winter on a short-term basis if they had been previously designated as residential?
They can't, because that's only the findings. You have to then get into the subsequent portion of the ordinance that begins with 41.4. So there, what is controlling is 41.19. 41.19. That was just part of the findings. We did not go in and change any of the findings, or he did, the supervisor didn't.
No,
So that was part of what formulated what comes later. So what controls on that is 41.19, which is temporary change in occupancy. Okay? So the findings are merely findings.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I would like some positive neck reinforcement. You know, I mean, I understand what's going on. But my question is, if this is supposed to be really for the people who are like, lower income and elderly, then this is my problem. If any person who rents from me is a permanent resident from the day they walk in the door, it's going to be Fort Knox to get into my place, because I want good people that I don't have to worry about, where I don't have to hire more security. If I'm lowering, prices, I'm not paying hotel taxes, of course, which is nice. But that means I have to have added people for nighttime. I'm not going to be able to afford all my housekeepers, who are people who work and, who make this certain income with kids, single moms. Those people I won't be able to keep everybody, which is sad, because some have been with me for a long time, their family, so that was a little upsetting. But if they're gonna be coming in for a month to be permanent, that means I'm gonna do security deposits, first month's rent, and it's gonna increase their cost for someone who's not making as much money as somebody else. I don't understand how it helps somebody like that.
We have to finance those people.
No, I won't have to finance those people, but I'm saying, but as my lease is gonna be.
We don't have the money to get it.
No, I'm just saying, but like I really, if that's the point of this, which I understand what the original point and what the updated version is. I understand we have an issue here in San Francisco. I'm on 16th and Mission. I understand every day, you know. The navigation center's in the middle of the block, but I'm saying it's gonna increase those people's costs, and it's gonna be a credit check and background check, because if the people have monthlies now, of course, but they're people that have come for a week, and they liked it, and I met them, and they come in. I'm not gonna be able to advertise on the internet, so that means you're lowering my income, my revenue for the business, and my permits are not going down, my insurance isn't going down, my property taxes is definitely not going down, all my prices and wages are going up. How am I gonna stay in business at 16th and Mission?
Well,
You know, I mean, these are my concerns.
okay, and you can advertise, no one is saying you can't.
I've met with Peskin, and I've said everything I just said to you, but I'm saying the point, I think, is being what the picture is. Here's the bubble, here's the problem. I don't think that's the solution, and not that it's a moot point now. My point is that if it's gonna increase their costs, how does that help those people?
So what did Supervisor Peskin tell you?
He just, I mean, we had a meeting with him, with several of us, and I discussed exactly what I said. My concern, I said, I don't understand how, if I'm not gonna be able to advertise for the internet in San Francisco, in the tech center of the world, it seems a little crazy to me. If I have to meet every single person, because I do 28 days. If you come and you stay a week, I have lots of monthlies that come and they're here for, I've had like up to 9-10 months, but there's no cooking. So an elderly or under, lower income person, you go out and eat every single day. I mean, that's crazy, Rosemary. That's fire code. I mean, I can't have microwaves or anything in those rooms. It's a small 1906 building. Those rooms are tiny, and I don't know. I mean, it's to protect my investment. And you know, the old owners before I took over this place were horrible. Didn't turn any paperwork in, and I've really tried to put my good foot forward. It's been really hard on that block. I mean, I've had my days. So I'm saying you're making me. I'm gonna have to let somebody go, which is sad. Because I won't be able to afford everybody.
So you did meet with Peskin?
I met with him and I said every single thing I said to you, and he just nodded, and the next day everybody had SROs or housing to stickers on, and nobody else got to speak, and he didn't seem very concerned. So whatever, I felt late to the table. If I'd known, I went to every single one of those meetings, January, February, I missed December. But I'm saying, like, we were supposed to be able to speak to the board the last week, and then at the end they just said, no, we're not taking anyone to speak. I just thought it was like, these are constituents. I pay property taxes. A lot of property taxes. I mean,
So I'm not, they wouldn't, okay, so let's talk about the
last meeting they had
procedure.
on February 7th, the day before my birthday, we went in and they said to arrive at 1:30 to sign up to be able to speak in front of the board. I was there at 1:20. No one opened the door till 2:15. They started at 2:30 and they said we weren't allowed to speak.
Well, let's talk about that just to clarify. It's my understanding that the public hearing was on January 23rd. Once it went to the full board, which is their legislative practice, the hearing was closed at that point in time. So there was no public testimony.
It was full of people yelling, and Randy Shaw and all the tenants were yelling with signs and everything, and I don't believe that we were really happy to get a chance to speak because we felt so,
Well, that's your choice, but what I'm saying is that was
it was like not a good environment.
That was the public hearing. There was no public testimony when it went to the full board because the hearing was closed. And that is typically what they do when the clerk of the board could advise you better than I, but the hearing on these matters is at their subcommittee. Once it gets to the full board, the hearing is closed, and so it's the board having a discussion or questions of staff or whatever, but that would have been the public hearing. It's not, I have no control over it.
I'm just saying, but
Right.
you understand my point.
Sure, I understand.
I understand your position, and
Sure.
Rosa, thank you for calling me back.
Absolutely.
I'm just saying, I just don't understand how it fixes that. I don't mind doing monthlies, I'm saying, but the monthlies I'm gonna do, it's not gonna be helping those people that they're trying to help. It's gonna be more expensive, and it's people who are here that don't wanna pay $3,000 for an apartment, but they're gonna pay $1,800, and they're gonna do a security deposit, and I'm gonna have a background check. So I don't have to have nighttime security, which costs a lot of money, and you're adding that, and then not be able to do as many housekeepers or maybe as many front desk staff. It's just, I don't understand the point. I think it's not the solution. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
for listening.
Oh, absolutely. And the next person, who else would like to speak on this?
On the quorum, I guess you're not meeting the quorum on many, many agendas on many, many occasions. Is there a list of people that are never here or could not make it that have on records that basically said that they could not be here?
Be here?
Yeah, as part of this SRO task force for that agenda or for that meeting, and that's why it was canceled, or that's why
There wasn't a quorum. We didn't have enough people that could be here.
they don't list who's not here.
Well, if we get information that we're not going to have enough people, then we won't meet.
How do you get that information?
We send out a email and we ask people if they're going to attend, and if we don't have that information, if we have information that we're not going to have a quorum, then we don't meet because we can't do any activity. Here, we did have people say that they were going to come even though they didn't show up. That's the difference. And let me just speak to the item where some of you are under the misconception that legislation gets vetted here. That's up to the legislator. If they want to put that on the calendar, they can. Your hearing was before the Board of Supervisors. That's where you have to have the discussion, because you have somebody that is legislating that. If he's an experienced legislator, if he wanted to put that on the agenda here, he would have done so. He did not do so. So the best all I could have done was say that that's out there, and I would have been more than happy to do that if we would have had that agenda. But it's all behooves all of you to really, like everyone else does, to watch those agendas and see what's happening and interact with those supervisors rather than coming late to the table. I have to say, I've been dealing with your group for many, many years, and I'm somewhat surprised that you're not as organized as you need to be. The last time you were this organized was about 20 years ago or so, when we did the residential hotel sprinkler ordinance. So I would really advise you to have somebody pay attention to these agendas, because quite frankly, I did not pick up the call and talk to a tenants group or a landlords group, and right now I am so busy with this and so many other things. I strongly, no, but I'm just saying, I want to see you get better organized so that
We're not blaming you.
Yeah, no, and I know that, but I know that, but I'm just saying, you really do, because Janann New called me, because she was sitting there. She is the Apartment House Association executive director, and she called me, and she said you were all meeting with them, and I said, that's great, they're getting organized, right? But it's up to you to do that. I cannot do that. This is a supervisor this is his second time as a supervisor. He picks who he's going to call and deal with this. They came to us, they asked us for the information, we have to give that to us. He did say that I shepherded this because I have more practical understanding of this ordinance than any other regulator, but you know who comes after me? Supervisor Peskin. And it is unusual to have a supervisor have this kind of institutional memory, but he has it. He has who starts with a history of residential guest rooms nationally. I mean, he was so on top of this, it's phenomenal. So that's unusual, but he can have that because he was the president of the board before, and he's a very, very smart man. But I do strongly advise you to give assistance to Sam and others so that they have the time to be able to follow up on these and keep track of it. And here's tools that I would definitely advise you look at. Always look at the board agenda. Always look at the planning or the building agenda. We have a legislative manager by the name of Bill Strong who did make some mention of this, but our commission was asking about it too. It was up to the supervisor to be able to let people know when he was ready to introduce his legislation.
Just want to take a
Sure,
question. It
sure.
was about and thank you for, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
But I work 90-hour weeks, so
Yeah.
I'm busy too. I run 2 properties, so it's just a small town. Me, I go shopping.
And I completely understand. That's why I advise
Yes,
to
of course.
assign somebody to do it.
But technical question, because
Mm-hmm.
you would be the one enforcing it, is that if I'd known before, I've stopped now taking any reservations for any of those rooms until we know exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
Stopped. Everything's blocked. So they were cut off. So I'm losing money, but that's okay. So I want to know, because if I'd known before, I would have blocked it earlier.
Right.
Just so I don't have to ask this question about reservations I already have taken. Because that's,
How far into the future are we looking at?
I would say to me,
Just to get an idea.
I'm saying to me at least July. I have reservations through
Okay.
July.
Well, we know
Maybe
that
some August, but that's it.
even if the mayor signs it today, it doesn't go into effect until 30 days from today. And it's not like 30 days from now, we're going to be lowering the hammer on everybody because we do realize that we've got to go out there and do a lot of educational and let you know what this means and practically what it means for your operation. So
That's my question about when would
yeah,
it be
yeah,
enforced?
it's not typical for us when there's this kind of overhaul of legislation to come at you with enforcement without, especially if you're demonstrating that you're trying to work within the realm of the ordinance. So there's going to be a period of time, what actually it is yet I don't know, but there'll definitely be a period of time when we send out notifications, when we try and meet with people, when we have a workshop like this, but probably, spend a couple hours on it, go through it line by line and have this kind of discussion about what does it do to my operation and how what should I do? So we're planning to do a good deal of that. So I hope that helps you a little
Yes,
bit,
that makes me feel
and that helps me know that, you've got, the reservations out that far. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I understand that you're saying that we're late to the table and we're all.
Well, no, it's just encouraging. I don't know exactly when you have these discussions, but it's just encouraging you as a tool to look at these things because even I didn't know when it was scheduled for the 23rd until I came back in January, and then I was told it was coming in about a week, even though I believe it was on the legislative resources that the board keeps on the web, and that's definitely something to look at too. But in any case, it's just something that I encourage you to do.
I understand that. And the thing is though that this ordinance has a serious effect on property values, on the incomes that hotels can generate. It just seems like for our industry, there should be some sort of here we have to mail out every single residential hotel. Here we're planning to propose these changes. There should be like a mailing that goes out to every single hotel saying that, hey, we're going to do this we're going to make these changes to your property or to your license. This task force should somehow figure out a way and put into some kind of ordinance that says that when these supervisors want to make changes like this, that they actually send out some sort of notice to these hotel owners so that we can then say, hey, this is good for us or bad for us. But it just seems like this was just kind of, they did it in December. I mean, a lot of people know that in the winter months, a lot of Indian owners are in India because that's the winter months are they're not even around during that time. And why did they, if they knew back in the spring that they needed to make these changes, why did they wait till December, to put this up, to make these proposals, And so, it seemed like it was kind of done, in a way that it was just kind of brought on us, and we were like blindsided kind of stuff.
Well, obviously I can't answer when the supervisor chose to introduce the legislation. It was, I heard it just like everyone else. But I will tell you that it is our practice when an ordinance gets adopted that we will be doing mailers and doing workshops to let people know when it is adopted. I mean, we're doing that now only because it's passed the board. It's not yet law, but we expect it probably will be. So we will, just as we did with the sprinkler ordinance, we did that, but we did it after the ordinance got created, not before, because we don't know as things are going through the legislative process if it will ever even be introduced. So that's why, as a regulatory agency, we have to wait. With respect to the task force, again, we are a board task force. So if the supervisor wanted to vet this before he went to the board, it was his prerogative to do so, but I cannot force him to do that. So now we have something that looks like it's imminently going to be finally adopted, depending upon what the mayor does. Have you talked with the mayor's office? Because he hasn't yet signed it, from my understanding.
I think I tried to.
I mean, I expect that he's going to sign it, and even if he didn't, given the amount of people that approved it, they could override a veto, but I would not expect this mayor to veto this legislation, given what his background is. Okay, so we're going to be doing that. So, and I want to definitely hear from you, so I don't want to say too much, except that we're going to be doing that. So, did you have a...
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Diana Martinez, the program manager of the Mission SRO Collaborative.
Welcome, Diana. And probably will be our next member for the Mission Collaborative.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all. One of the things I noticed is that we haven't heard a lot of the tenant's perspective. I know that you've got that seat vacant as well. So
One of them.
having worked with a lot of SRO tenants, I would like to say that this is something that the majority of the SRO tenants that we work with approve with flying colors. Because of that gray area between the 7 days and the 32 days, there's a lot of leeway for an SRO owner or manager to have tourists stay, but they're tourists that stay for longer than 7 days, which of course it's San Francisco, who wouldn't want to visit here for longer than 7 days, right? But what we have found in the past few years that I've been working at the collaborative is that there are few SROs that are purposefully renting, that are purposefully advertising and renting on tourist websites. For example, we found some Mission SROs being advertised on Airbnb and other short-term rental sites. And this is probably a surprise to some of you, since you seem like you're very responsible SRO owners. But really what this legislation does to tighten up these hinges is to really hold the rule-breaking SRO owners and managers accountable. And it really is a lot more fair to the responsible SRO owners such as yourselves, because these are the people you're competing with, right? And you want your business practices to remain on a level playing field, right? If your competitors are breaking the law without any consequences, it really actually hurts you, because if you're playing by the rules and they're breaking all these rules and making a lot more money than you, they've got more money to have better business practices, better conditions, and as you said, more receptionists and cleaning staff, and that's really not fair to you.
No, listen, I would have to let some of it go.
Oh.
These are people who are working people,
Right.
single moms with kids. because
Right,
of the-
okay, so yes, so that is why this is important, because it holds others accountable to the same standards that you are holding yourselves. And also, I would like to say that this is, basically I would like to say that oftentimes we think that we aren't as protected as we really are, but that lease that they sign, it does protect you at the beginning.
No, no, the lease is my
And
lease is
another
hardcore.
thing that is very important to know is that you do have an ally in the SRO collaboratives, because since we work so much with the tenants, we have a lot more of a trust with them. We build relationships with the tenants, and we don't just educate tenants on their rights, but we educate them on how the law holds them accountable. So I really do invite you, particularly if you have an SRO in the mission, to talk with me afterwards, because we do work with landlords, and when they are having issues with their tenants, whether it be with paying the rent on time or things of that nature, and we
Will
can
you
be
come
that
and
middle
investigate them
person.
without any
Okay,
phone calls?
Rosemary, I think, if they're having a discussion amongst themselves.
So
shouldn't be
thank
part of
you,
this.
and
What's
you
going
don't
on?
have to interrupt me, I'm
Yes.
almost.
Yeah, I've let everybody speak, so let's let her finish, and then
That's
we'll go on
correct.
to the next speaker.
So you're welcome to talk to me afterwards if you have an SRO in the mission. I'd love to be a better resource and a kind of a bridge between the tenants and landlords. It doesn't have to be an antagonistic relationship. But in short, I really do think that this legislation helps tighten up the hinges to protect both tenants and landlords. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
Yes, this determination of a hearing officer on tourist season rentals of residential units, you can petition to exceed the 25% limit in the summer, right?
And that's what it is in right now.
And
Yes, that's not
there's no
changed.
change there.
Mhm.
So, as a practical matter, do they grant your permission to do that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. In the last, since I've been associated with the ordinance since around the 90s, no one has ever come in to do it. Because they have to pay for the hearing, and you've got to prove or give, I mean, it would be cost prohibitive unless you had evidence that you've been trying to rent those rooms to try and go beyond the 25%. So no one has asked for the hearing and,
Why
since.
would it be cost prohibitive?
Well, only because if you can't prove that you've been trying to rent the room.
Well, you would prove it, you'd show. that
Right,
you're
right, but what
running
you asked, and I'm telling you from a practical standpoint, no one has asked for that hearing since.
Why?
Because they can't prove that, that they have been actively trying to rent the room for residential use before.
They can't prove that,
They-
they
but-
can't show that they ran
So
ads.
nobody you asked, and I'm telling you, no one has asked for the hearing. Now, if somebody tomorrow felt that they could, and they wanted a hearing, and they wanted to pay for the hearing, that process is no different, but no one has requested that hearing
How
since
much
the
does a hearing
90s.
cost?
Well, we would have to look at what the cost would be today to hire a hearing officer and do that. And then we would want to talk with you to see what kind of evidence to give you some input on that. But that has not changed. That has been in the ordinance all along. This legislation did not change that.
And that hasn't been a popular thing to do at all.
No? Mm-mm.
I have
Yeah.
a question about that. What's the proof you have to come up with?
Well, you have to show that you've actively been trying to use the rooms for, rent them for residential use. And so, we'd have to see your advertising or whatever it would be, and then you would have to feel comfortable that it was enough that you could convince a hearing officer to exceed the 25%.
That doesn't seem very difficult. You show them a couple Craigslist ads.
Yeah, you asked, all I'm saying is no one has requested it,
What is the
and since
cost
the
of the hearing
90s.
in round numbers? $100,000, $2,000?
To do a hearing? Oh, no,
$500?
no, I don't think, no, it wouldn't be that.
What would be a ballpark?
Oh, I would say it would be, maybe 25,000 or less to do that. It wouldn't be 100,000. But we would have to look at what it is, because we would have to go and get a hearing officer to do that, and you would have to give us a request as to how many rooms and what you were looking at. But as I said, no one has availed themselves of that since the 90s that I'm aware of, so. But it's not changed. Bruce?
I think this is really quick. Converting residential to tourist or moving the license,
Okay,
is that a DBI final decision or planning? I really don't know.
Sure, it's an excellent question. So the way it works is, say, let's do an example. Say you've got a residential hotel of 50 residential guest rooms, no tourist, and you want to, say, convert all of those to, let's just say, to residential. You want to convert the building.
Other way.
Generally, that type of conversion is always going to require, in 99.9% of the time, a conditional use permit through the planning department. So you have a couple choices. The Chapter 41 basically says that for DBI, and DBI does the final granting of the permit to convert, so it's through the Director of Building Inspection, but it also says that before he can grant that, the application has to be consistent with the planning code, right? And so that means you have to go to planning to get the approval, which is usually a permit, it's usually a conditional use application that has conditions of approval, and then what happens is, we get a letter and we get that motion from planning, and we have to have all that before we can grant approval. And it also has to do with the type of replacement options you've chosen. If it's in lieu fees, we deal with that. If you're choosing the construction of a different building or siting the units in a different building, it could involve the Mayor's Office of Housing as well. But the ultimate approval is from DBI. However, in addition to the consistency with the planning code, if a interested party or anyone else wants to challenge the validity of the permit to convert as far as comparability, it's interesting that that appeal or that hearing goes before the Planning Commission, not the Building Inspection Commission. In fact, there isn't, because this ordinance pre-existed the Building Inspection Commission and the department. We were a bureau under DPW before that. That's the path. So the property owner that says that has to get the conditional use, if somebody also protests the comparability, the Planning Commission could hear both those things at the same time, but that would have to happen before DBI could do a ultimate approval. Now, If you are doing a situation where you're building units and it's not in lieu fees, approval is a two-step process anyway, because you get conditions of approval for the conditional use, and then you say once you satisfy all those conditions, then you get final approval. But it's ultimately from DBI with those other aspects to it. So does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, ultimately it comes down to DBI. after
It
you
does,
come
but
through all
these
the-
other things have to happen
Right.
first.
No, I agree.
So if you never go to planning to get your approval, DBI would have to disapprove.
Right.
Right. Now, if we disapprove, where does it go? You can appeal the disapproval before the Board of Permit Appeals. But if you want to contest the conditional use, that would go before the board. So you've got, it can get complicated. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other discussion on this at all? So we will be, DBI, once this gets finally adopted, we will be holding some workshops. We'll be sending out a lot of informative information. And before the annual unit usage reports are due in November, we generally send a mailer out 30 days before. I envision probably 3 or 4 months before we're going to send information out to let people know. And then the package with the annual unit usage reports will also have more information to give people more understanding. We generally send those out to the owner, but then we'll also, if we have the operator's information, we'll send out a duplicate to the operator as well. So.
I did have a question. You were mentioning, when you were talking about the bullet points of the ordinance, you mentioned something about the 7-day rule, and then you said it's not going to be up to DBI or up to us anymore. It's between the tenant and
What I was talking about was the payment schedule. Because the legislation is now shifted where how the residential use is defined, and what you have to look at, what's controlling is the definition of the tourist use in the definition section, right? So that basically says that you're looking at a 32-day rental, okay? So how you accept payment, will no longer be a situation where we say to you, you can't accept payment for 7 days. The issue is whether or not it's a residential rental or not. And we'll be looking at your records to see, from your receipts, how long that person has been in place within that unit. And if there is a situation where it looks like the building is illegally converting residential guest rooms, then the city does have the power to issue an administrative subpoena. How that happens, as I said, is a case of first impression to DBI. That is new in here. We've not done that before. So we'll be working out those policies. And as we figure out what that is, we will definitely share that with you. Did you have a question?
Just in line with this topic here, are we equipped at DBI in housing inspection to monitor all these monthly reports, 12 times 500 hotels roughly, do the math obviously, and are we saying that we're going to hire more people behind this so that you can monitor that well, or are we saying we're going to keep status quo, and if anybody brings it to our attention, we will look into it?
So what monitoring are you talking about?
These monthly reports that everyone's going to be supposedly sending in.
They're not monthly reports. The annual unit usage report is the same report you do annually.
Well, to look at those annual unit usage reports, now it involves 12 months versus 4 or 5 months, I think it was. They have February, May, whatever, August, September, October, or something of that nature. Now you're looking at 12 months, and you're going to vet through those 12 months and see if these units are vetted properly or not. I know that we didn't have the resource before, probably. Are we getting the resource for that, or is it just status quo? We're just collecting the information. Anybody brings that this hotel or that hotel is not playing by the book, and you look into it.
Now, let me answer that. First of all, I think there's a bit of a miscommunication here. You file your annual unit usage report. It's due November 1st every year. Right now, it's asking you to attach 4 days of the daily logs that you were supposed to keep for that year. The new ordinance will say it wants about maybe 12 days of records that you were supposed to keep. So that's the difference there with the ordinance. the DBI staff right now goes through, and it has been, for those of you who have gotten the notice of insufficient filing, it goes through that entire annual unit usage report, and where there are deficiencies, the property owner gets 1 to 2 notices and will get fined if they haven't filed the complete information. So nothing changes there, that we're still doing that. Now, depending upon when we get them, we try and process those completely within a 45-day period, depending upon when they come in. But that has been done, and people have been getting their delinquent notices. And we even go back years, depending upon whether when we sent out a notice before, whether they ever complied. So that will continue. The difference will be, though, if you fail to comply now under this new ordinance, you won't be able to do the 25% rental between May to September. That gets taken away if we document and the property owner or the operator isn't quick to respond to that. So in answering, I'll probably need to add another person onto it, but we're already processing those. So if you haven't got it, that means you've been filing them completely. But for those that haven't been, they're getting letters and they're getting fines.
I have a question.
Sure.
If you're suffering vacancies in the winter, you want to rent out someone's tourists, is there any way to appeal that or petition for that?
Well, it depends upon the makeup of your building. If you're all residential and you've got vacancies in the winter and you want to rent the rooms for tourists,
Let's say you've got, in the summer you rent 25% for tourists, okay? Like, you could, under the current law, you can rent 25% of your units.
Of your residential rooms from May
summer, yeah.
to September.
But in the winter, let's say you've got a lot of vacancies. Is there a way to petition to have some of those rented as short-term?
I don't believe that there is a current mechanism within the ordinance right now to rent the rooms for tourist use. I'll be happy to look at it, but I don't think there is.
Marketed that at the fair market value, you can prove that you ran ads.
And you can't rent it for residential, but you could for tourists.
Correct.
Meaning less than 32 days.
Correct.
I'll definitely, if you give me your contact information, I'll comb through it to see if there's any kind of petition in there for that.
I'm sure that's near and dear to a lot of owners here. Face it, in the winter, things slow down. But, it's always easier to rent a unit for 3 or 4 days than it is for 32 days. So it has a significant economic impact on owners. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new. And this whole ordinance is designed to not take housing away from low-income tenants. I don't think any of us are against the spirit of this, but the real truth of the matter is there's a lot of excess capacity sitting in these buildings right now. It's hard to rent SROs in the winter, okay? So if we could petition and say, look, we've advertised it at fair market, we've held it open for the permanent residents, they haven't come, can we rent some of them to tourists for less than 30 days during the winter? That is the $64 question.
Well, I'll definitely look at it and get back to you because that wasn't changed in this particular legislation. But let me tell you what the board members' response to that would be, not me personally, but they would say, given the housing crisis, they would be hard-pressed to believe that you couldn't rent that room for residential use because there's so many people out there. But the thing is and this is the other thing that we need to discuss, and that is Chapter 41 that we're talking about today does not establish the price that you ask for your room. That is done through other ordinances, the rent ordinance or whatever. That does not do this. It never precluded you from screening people to come into your building. That you do. So if given, what your price is, if you can't rent the room for whatever, I completely understand that. I'll take a look at it. But that would be, if you go talk to any of the supervisors, that would be something that you'd probably hear. But I'd be more than happy to research that and get back to you.
That'd be very helpful.
Also,
yes.
for resources for, as you say, there's so many people looking for housing, it's very difficult to find who are they, Unfortunately, I see them banging on people's doors. There's vacant units that are waiting for them. Would there be a way for you guys to help us find those people?
That need housing.
Well, I think you had a comment for, the SRO collaboratives that Angela and others would be, Sam shaking his head, would be probably more than happy to have that discussion with you. But again, your screening that's you. You own the building as far,
We've got vacancy.
So,
We need
This,
to talk, right?
so, let,
I have a
John,
question,
Mhm.
and I'm kind of, this puzzled me for,
Sure.
has been puzzling me for several years.
Uh-huh.
How does the DBI, how do we determine what's considered fair market value?
Well, that's-
Location, is it?
Square footage, location, and usually.
I mean, how does DBI say,
We-
this is, when you petition, this is not fair, but you're not advertising at fair market value? How do you?
we
guys-
don't, we never get to that issue. It's not an issue that's within our jurisdiction. That's totally, as I said, the amount that you rent the unit for is totally up to you. This ordinance doesn't deal with that. The only time it may come into play is if you're filing a permit to convert the units, it does ask for some information. But that's if you're wanting to file an application to convert units because of the comparability issue. But other than that, as far as your daily operations and what you charge for a room, we have nothing, DBI has nothing to do with that. The ordinances that deal with that might be the rent ordinance, might be state law.
That's not
but-
what he's asking.
Yeah.
Of course, the answer is you provide them with comparable buildings. of
Right, but we
similar size.
never look at that. That's up to you, that's not us. We don't look at that. We don't know what the fair market value is. That's totally up to you, what that is.
But if
Okay.
we were to appeal,
Yeah.
if you said you were gonna look into it, we would build a case and show you 10 buildings that are renting for this, and we'd show you the vacancy and say it's fair market, you'd say, yeah, it's reasonable. No, that's the easy part. The real question is,
Uh-huh.
can you find any authority anywhere that would say, if we were to give you that data and show you that we truly marketed it
Uh-huh.
at fair market value
Uh-huh.
and are suffering vacancy, can we therefore rent them short term? That's the most operative question of this whole meeting.
Well, I think they've got different issues, but that's very fine.
And if
We'll look at
these other
that.
folks representing SRO collaboratives say, oh, God, we need a bunch of rooms, then bring it on, 'cause we've got them.
I had a
Okay,
question.
sure.
Just about like, I know, what if someone pays for, a monthly or 2 months or 3 months, but leaves a little bit early before like the 3 months were over, for example? Like, do I just block that room off for the rest of the time because they paid the rent, like I would do?
Well-
You know what I mean, like,
So in a situation like that, if it's a residential room, would you be renting it to somebody subsequently for residential use?
no, that's what I'm saying. It's
Yeah.
more than like they stay a month, 2 months, 3 months,
Right,
but
right.
they paid the rent each month.
Right.
And they leave early because they found the apartment they wanted or something like
Right.
this. So like, do I block the room off for the rest of the time?
See, because of the changes, no, I don't think you need to. I think if your subsequent person that you rent that room to is for residential occupancy and you keep your documents, then I believe that that's not going to be problematic for you. But we could talk about that further.
So what
But
if-
that's one of the things this does do.
Sorry. So what if they signed the lease for 32 days, but then they left early just because they chose to do that? We know.
It's not a problem.
It's not a problem because your subsequent rental would be residential. It was before because it was a little different situation as far as payment being linked to 7 days, but now that it's a 32-day rental, it's a different thing. So, are there any other questions I could answer right now? And then, as I said, we'll have some workshops and then I will get back. Does anybody have any other questions you want me to answer offline and do some research on? I'm more than happy to do so, because some of these I may have to talk to the city attorney about. Yes?
So when we define transitional housing,
I'm sorry, could you?
when we
Thank
define
you.
transitional housing
Uh-huh.
and tourist unit and tourist hotel residential unit, I'm more interested to know what is the difference between transitional housing and residential unit?
Okay, well, the issue there would be, is I would need you to tell me what you, aside from the definitions that are in here, give me a little more information, so, because I
don't
can't
know,
quite tell.
Are they under the same umbrella of this ordinance?
Well, again, it's telling you that a tourist rental is less than 32 days. So if you're talking about some transitional housing that is a residential rental, then we would definitely look at that and work with you on it. It depends upon what you mean by that. If it is that you've got rooms within your building that you have a contract with the city to provide some transitional housing, then we would definitely look at that and look at what the characteristics are of that, to give you an example.
What I mean is, okay, going with that, the city contracts with the hotel and they take their rooms for whatever lease, whatever they are doing.
Right.
And so they're moving in a tenant and then they're moving out a tenant because he no longer is part of that, or they transitioned him into an apartment or transitioned him into another services. So that room technically was occupied by somebody for a week, 10 days, or 12 days, or even 23 days, whatever it may have been, and they transitioned that person out.
Right.
Now, is that construed as tourist? I mean, not tourist, but not permanent or not residential?
Well, I think it would be construed as residential. It's definitely not tourist because the city is in the process of renting that for, providing residential housing to somebody, even if it's transitional housing. So again, we would need to look at what the particulars are of that, but the city isn't renting that for the purpose of a tourist rental,
Okay, so
right? It's a part of the residential programs, which they have several.
But the city doesn't even fall under the HCO though, right?
But I'm assuming that there are nonprofit organizations out there, not just a main one, but there are many of them. And from what I've heard and what I'm just trying to get a pulse on this, is that they use some of these SROs for moving in somebody there for 2 weeks because they're moving them into another studio rental or they're moving them into something. So they use this as a temporary stay.
But it's residential housing. It's not tourist. Let me give you an example, if I may. If it's some kind of a youth hostel that happens to have a nonprofit type of situation, and they're renting it for purposes of short-term tourist rental, and we did have a situation that kind of got like that, that would be different. But if the city is renting it for the purposes of providing transitional housing and it's not a tourist, then that would be different. But that's the only answer I could give you right now. We would have to look at the specifics. So that would qualify as residential because it's not tourist. But aside from that, we would need to look at the particulars. Did you have
like sometimes there's a fire in an SRO or something, and you need to put people up temporary somewhere else, like the Red Cross does that. How would that apply?
How would that be? Well, that would not be a tourist rental. That would not be a tourist rental. It would be a residential
Even
rental.
though the Red Cross puts in, it gives you a voucher.
Right, because it's not, if it's somebody that was a resident that is being displaced, that's different than a tourist rental. That's a completely different thing. So, but, we'll be happy to look at, the specifics of that. But what the city is looking at is the fact that they're trying to house that person. It's not a tourist. So, any other questions? So, if anybody's got you could ask me now or later. So I've got my cards over here. Please follow up with me. My email is on there. Bernadette can take your contact information if anybody wants me to get, and you, sir, I definitely want to get back to you, so if you could get his contact information, that would be great. Thank you. We don't have a quorum, even though we some of the people did come and we lost one. That's the nature of this. So
We've got so many people who are vacant.
and I am having those conversations with the supervisors, so trying to get them to add additional people.
We're not the cool kids anymore. We only got one phone.
I know.
What?
We're not the cool kids anymore. We only got one phone.
You guys got 2 phones each.
Man.
This is the city phone. City and personal.
Thank you. I'll contact you.
And I'm deaf, so I can't.
That's even better. A true blessing in disguise.
So even when it's like, sometimes I think I've got it off, and my fear is like I'm at the full board and it goes off and it's mine. Sure.
So, just as he brought up, I have stopped mailing weeklies. Does that mean, like, in the meantime,
Then you got it.
if I get to know, like, it's official, we can still do that?
Well, I would, knowing that the ordinance is coming, I would be slowing that down and documenting that you're doing that, so that if we get a complaint or whatever, the thing is, I would not take any more, that's my advice. I mean, obviously, as we think it's going to get, and then on all the ones that you're trying to change, document that so that if we ever got a complaint, we could look and go, well, as soon as they saw that this was coming, they started to change their business plan, so,
It's easier to moving and walk it.
And I have all three, I have a few that them in December that I had already had a contract with last year. So that's my concern, the ones that I already went into agreement with. What am I going to do?
How far out are we talking?
December. I have a few in
December.
I mean, but we could also, I mean, we just looked at the spreadsheet of when the reservations are made, and since we stopped, and I have those reservations, I'm not gonna, like, look at how much, you know, it's also encouraging us.
Yeah, do the best you can, but the thing is if you're handling these others, you had a contract there, we're gonna try and work with you. And if you never get a complaint, you know, we're not gonna necessarily come at you. Do you have all residential or residential and tourist?
I have only 13 tourists.
So would this go beyond the tourist? Okay, see, so that's a violation right now, but I would, you know, do what you can and we'll try and work with you.
And I do have, just so you know, I do have from the day that it was approved, so that I can prove that we're already in agreement. So I mean, if anything, I'll try to also work my best to kind of work with them, but if not, that's my own concern.
Gotcha. And take my card and then follow up with me if there's anything else that comes up. I'd be more than happy to try and work with you.
Okay, all right, thank you.
You're welcome. Hello. Happy New Year. You are too. Thank you for coming. I work. So yeah, we're going to have workshops and so you know what I've been dealing with is ghost ship.
Oh, yes.
And the displacement, we got a building on Mission where you've got a bunch of people living in a basement of a commercial building. They went out and did a task force inspection on that yesterday and they've got all these people potentially displaced. So trying to work with the city attorney and Tommy Mecca's working on that. So it's a 3-story building where there was a church in the upstairs where it may be that the Department of Homelessness might be able to help the property owner put them upstairs. So we've been behind the scenes really trying to get the building inspectors who aren't used to this to understand, because we went out there on this, so I got all the upper management of the department around a table on a Friday and we were calling all over trying to get them some housing. So their thought process is completely changing on this. So it's huge. It's a major, major change.
Hi. Here's my card. Yes, thank you so
We'll try and
much.
help you.
I know there's a lot of complicated issues.
Oh boy.
This is beautiful.
This is a
This Paskins baby and he had a lot of support. So I understand the spirit of legislation. But again, my question is, if we can build a case that we advertise.
you can kind of explain to me what your portfolio is. I'll look at it and I'll give you my best.
Basically, SROs being marketed in market value, they're sitting vacant, so, you know, I think it's just hard to rent small.
I'll be there.
You know what I'm saying? In the in the summer they rent no problem.
And the thing is since you're building, and you get to, police and back in the day, you know, valuable things, you get to, depending upon how, you know, how well maintained your building is, you get to do that. I can see a lot of people kind of morphing these into more like an apartment building type thing, you know, with, we're seeing a lot of the tech bubble started to soften up, obviously, but we were seeing people wanting these, you know, remodel them a little bit, nice bathrooms, nice kitchens, and these youngsters were, you know, just eating this up, but that's not gonna last forever.
It's gonna cool.
So, yeah, it's already started.
So, yeah, these do not have private baths and kitchens, so
no. So
they're
you've got,
harder to rent.
the European type of course, over there, they now put bathrooms in most of those.
So if we can use some short-term rentals over the winter, then we're
So let me look at it and see, and then I'll give you a call.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Take care.
My seat is
Yes.
I just have one question. I got a couple of calls about timeshares.
Yeah, there are a few out there.
They fall under home rule.
Well, it depends upon if they're on the list. If not, it depends upon what it is. We've got a couple apartment buildings that are timeshares. And like when we do our license fees, like those we're supposed to be doing them separately because there's no way to put like 50 cents for, so we try and do there on our license fees. We haven't done it lately. I've lost track of how many there's maybe a handful. We would build them separately, but it's like generally they're not residential hotels. Generally they're not. They don't fall under those.
Because that's a good
I mean, I guess they could try and do it, but we would then look at the owner and deal with that,
Because we have some hotels too that have some timeshare.
There are some, and an interesting thing is San Francisco is weird. In other jurisdictions, when you do the map to do that, usually you have to have approval from the county council or whatever. Here, the city is just starting to look at that and saying, maybe we need to have a parcel that is just for the homeowner association or the operator. So at least then we can deal with that for like notices of violation. Like when you have large condos, so it's a different thing.
Because these are owners.
Yeah, thousands of owners.
That's right. We only use one vehicle.
If you find a couple, email them to me and we'll research them and let you know.
Okay, and then, where you guys are going to
Hill right now, downtown. Right by the
I saw that there was
No, they're not.
I'll reach out to you.
Thank you. They may be. You mean they have certain rooms? If they do, they might be. Yeah, exactly. That might be. The thing is when they did the original designation, there was a private club designation. So they're probably completely exact, depending upon what happened in the early 80s. So we can, with the address, we could look and see. But yeah, there were some that were private clubs that were taken completely out of it, that are not part of this inventory.
I saw the definition on what the designation
Right, and then they were put in categories. And so I inherited that. So they would probably be a Z or a private club or something. And we could always check it and let you know what the database says. You're welcome. Okay, so